Ever wonder what it was like to face down a world where every single day was a fight for survival, where the most precious thing you held could be snatched away in an instant? What if the year was 590th and you were a woman, a mother with tiny, vulnerable lives depending on you? Could you truly protect your children from the relentless onslaught of a dangerous, unpredictable world? Number 1. The precarious social status of women. Imagine a woman in 590, at her hands rough from constant work, her eyes sharp from vigilance, yet her voice often unheard. Her very existence, and by extension, the safety of her children, was often tethered to the whims and fortunes of men. This wasn't a world of independent women with legal rights to property or standing in courts. Instead, a woman's identity was frequently defined by her relationship to a man. A daughter, a wife, a widow. This precarious social standing meant that her ability to protect her offspring was severely constrained, a challenge that rippled through every aspect of her life. Consider the young woman, perhaps named Lara, living in a small, isolated village in what was once Roman Gaul, now a territory struggling under the nascent Merovingian kings. Her father had arranged her marriage when she was barely past childhood to a man twice her age, a farmer who owned a modest parcel of land. While she worked tirelessly alongside him, tending to the fields, grinding grain, and raising their 2 small children, the land, the meager dwelling, and even the children themselves were legally his property. Should her husband decide to sell a piece of land or make a decision that would affect their family's fortunes, Lara had little say. Her influence was subtle, often limited to persuasion within the confines of their home, a quiet whisper in his ear after a long day's toil. This lack of legal standing became a stark and terrifying reality for many women when tragedy struck. If her husband died, perhaps from a sudden fever or a wound sustained in a local skirmish, Lara would not automatically inherit his property. Instead, his male relatives, a brother, an uncle, or even a distant cousin, might lay claim to the land, and, chillingly, even the children. Historical records from the era pieced together from fragmented legal codes and charters reveal the concept of guardianship. A widow was often seen as incapable of managing her own affairs, or those of her children, requiring a male guardian to be appointed. This guardian could be kind or cruel, but the power he wielded over her family's future was immense. He could decide where she and her children would live, what work they would perform, and critically how any inheritance would be managed. For a mother like Lara, who had just lost her partner, the added burden of fighting to keep her children, to prevent them from being dispersed among different relatives or even sold into servitude to settle debts, was an unimaginable strain. She might find herself utterly dependent on the goodwill of others, having to plead, to bargain, to humble herself, to ensure her children were not taken from her, their very future hanging by a thread that she had no control over. Even if a woman had some wealth from her own family, perhaps a dowry, it often passed into her husband's control upon marriage. Should he squander it, or should it be lost to raids or famine, she had little recourse to recover it or use it to benefit her children. This economic powerlessness was a constant undercurrent of fear. A woman's ability to feed, clothe, and shelter her children was inextricably linked to the stability of her husband's economic situation. If he fell ill, if his crops failed, if he was taken captive, her entire world and the world of her children could collapse around her. She might be forced to undertake grueling, low-paying work, if she could find it, to keep her children from starving, always aware that her labor alone might not be enough. Concept of an independently employed woman earning a living wage to support a family was largely foreign to the societal structures of 590. Most women's work, while essential for survival, was domestic or agricultural, and rarely commanded independent financial compensation that could secure a family's future. Consider also the weight of reputation. A woman's standing in the community was paramount, often linked to her perceived morality and adherence to societal norms. If she was deemed unvirtuous or fell out of favor for any reason, perhaps she was a widow who remarried too quickly, or she was accused, justly or unjustly, of a transgression, her children could suffer the consequences. They might be ostracized, their prospects for marriage or good alliances diminished. The social stigma attached to a mother could easily transfer to her innocent children, creating a silent, insidious threat to their future well-being and acceptance within the tightly knit communities of the time. A woman's constant struggle was not just against external dangers, but also against the judgmental gaze of her neighbors, knowing that any misstep could jeopardize her children's standing. Furthermore, legal protection for women was minimal and often biased. If a woman was the victim of violence, especially within her own home, seeking justice was often an impossible task. The laws were frequently interpreted by male judges, and a woman's testimony might be dismissed or given less weight than a man's. This meant that a mother could be physically or emotionally abused, and her children would witness it. Yet she would have little power to remove herself or her children from the abusive situation. Her attempts to protect her children from such an environment would be hampered by the very legal and social structures meant to govern their lives. The idea of a safe house or a place to escape was non-existent. A woman's life was inextricably bound to her husband's household, and leaving it meant risking destitution, social condemnation, and the almost certain loss of her children. Even in cases of outright crime against her children, a mother's ability to seek justice was indirect. She could not, for instance, typically represent herself in court. She would need a male advocate, a father, a brother, or a new husband to speak on her behalf, to argue for her children's rights. This dependency meant that the pursuit of justice was often contingent on the willingness and ability of a man to act on her behalf. If no such champion existed, or if he was unwilling or unable to take up her cause, her children might never see justice for wrongs committed against them. Profound frustration of being unable to directly fight for her children, to defend them with her own voice and authority, must have been an agonizing daily burden for women across the social spectrum. The sheer vulnerability of being a single mother in 590 AD was immense. A widow, especially one without adult sons or powerful male relatives, was at the bottom of the social hierarchy. She was often viewed as a burden, as unprotected property, and her children were seen as potential laborers or worse, potential liabilities. This vulnerability made her and her children targets for exploitation, for displacement, or for outright seizure of their meager belongings. She was constantly on guard, not just against external threats like raiders or famine, but against the insidious threat of being forgotten, marginalized, or outright dispossessed by her own community or family. The daily struggle to maintain her family's dignity and survival in the face of such systemic disadvantage was a testament to incredible resilience. In a world where a woman's social standing was less than independent, her capacity to be a fierce, unyielding protector of her children was continually challenged by the very framework of society itself. Number 2. Harsh climate and inadequate shelter. Imagine the biting winds of winter sweeping through cracks in a flimsy wall, or the relentless summer sun baking down on a roof, barely able to keep out the heat. For women in 590, protecting their children from the relentless forces of nature was a constant, arduous struggle, often hampered by inadequate shelter and a profound lack of technological means to combat the elements. Their homes, whether a simple hovel in a rural village or a crowded tenement in a decaying city, offered only a tenuous barrier against the harsh realities of the outside world, making every season a battle for warmth, coolness, and dryness. Consider the frigid grip of winter. Much of Europe in 590, but especially the former Roman territories, experienced harsh winters with deep snows and freezing temperatures. Homes, built from whatever local materials were available, timber, wattle, and daub, Rough stone or repurposed Roman bricks were often poorly insulated. There was no glass for windows, only wooden shutters or animal hides stretched across openings, letting in drafts and providing little thermal protection. A mother, perhaps named Brigid, living in a small, smoky dwelling in Anglo-Saxon England, would spend countless hours gathering firewood, a back-breaking task often undertaken in the bitter cold. Every stick, every fallen branch was precious, for the warmth of the fire was the only defense against the penetrating cold that could numb tiny fingers and toes, or bring on life-threatening chills and respiratory illnesses. The central hearth, a blessing and a curse, was typically an open fire in the middle of the single living space, with a hole in the roof to let out some of the smoke. While it provided heat, it also filled the air with acrid smoke, irritating tiny lungs and making breathing difficult, especially for infants. Brigid would have to constantly monitor her young children, pulling them away from the flickering flames, fearing a spark landing on their simple woolen clothing, or a toddler tumbling into the scorching embers. Sleep for a mother was often fragmented, her ears straining for any sound that might indicate a child was too cold or too close to the fire. She might bundle her children in every piece of rough animal hide or coarse woven textile she possessed, often sleeping pressed close together for shared warmth, but the chill would always seem to find its way in. Frostbite was a very real danger, leading to terrible suffering and even loss of limbs, especially for young children whose bodies struggled to regulate temperature. But the challenges weren't limited to winter. Summer brought its own set of dangers. Without air conditioning or even effective ventilation, dwellings could become stifling hot. Infants and young children are particularly vulnerable to heat stroke and dehydration. A mother would have to find ways to keep her children cool, perhaps by wetting rough cloths and placing them on their foreheads, or trying to find a patch of shade outside the home during the hottest parts of the day. Water, vital for hydration, was often drawn from communal wells or streams, which could be contaminated, adding another layer of risk during the summer months when waterborne diseases flourished. Constant battle against insects, especially flies and mosquitoes, which thrived in warm, unsanitary conditions, was another challenge, as they carried diseases and caused irritating bites that could become infected. Rain and dampness were also relentless threats. Leaky roofs meant constant dampness inside the home, creating breeding grounds for mold and mildew, which contributed to respiratory problems. Wet conditions also meant muddy floors, increasing the risk of slips and falls for toddlers, and making it harder to maintain even basic hygiene. A mother would have to constantly patch and repair her home, using mud, thatch, or anything else she could find to keep out the elements, often a losing battle against the persistent drip and insidious damp. The fear of her children developing coughs that would not go away, or a persistent chill that led to a fever, was ever present, knowing how quickly a simple ailment could turn fatal in the absence of effective medicine. Beyond the home, nature itself presented dangers. Floods could wipe out entire villages, forcing families to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs, exposing their children to the elements and starvation. Mudslides, especially in hilly regions, could bury homes and families. Even the very structures of their simple homes could be hazardous. A loose stone, a rotting timber, a precarious roof could collapse, especially after heavy rains or strong winds, trapping or injuring those within. The lack of standardized building codes or strong, durable materials meant that structural integrity was always a concern, and every creak and groan of the dwelling was a reminder of its fragility. Imagine a woman named Lyra living near a river that seasonally swelled its banks. Every year, as the snows melted or the heavy rains began, she would cast anxious glances at the rising water levels. She would have to gather her few possessions, her small children, and make a desperate dash for higher ground, perhaps to a temporary shelter, a cave, or the home of a relative in a safer area. The journey itself would be fraught with danger, crossing treacherous terrain, carrying infants, trying to keep older children from falling into swollen streams or getting lost in the confusion. And when they returned, if their home was still standing, it would be waterlogged, cold, and unsanitary, requiring days of arduous cleaning and repair before it was even remotely habitable again. Constant cycle of rebuilding and recovery was exhausting, eroding a mother's strength and resilience, while her children remained vulnerable to the lingering effects of exposure and displacement. Furthermore, protection from wild animals was a significant concern, especially in rural areas or during displacement. Wolves, bears, and other predators still roamed freely in the forests surrounding settlements. Homes, even those with sturdy doors, might not be entirely secure. A mother would have to be vigilant, ensuring her children were always within sight, especially during twilight hours, and teaching them the dangers of wandering too far into the woods. The threat of snake bites or encounters with other dangerous creatures was also a very real concern, particularly for children playing outdoors or for women foraging for food. Challenge of inadequate shelter was not just about the physical discomfort, but about the continuous drain on a mother's resources and energy. Every ounce of her strength was poured into finding ways to keep her children warm, dry, and safe from the extremes of their natural environment. It meant endless chores, gathering fuel, patching walls, trying to dry damp bedding, all while simultaneously feeding, cleaning, and caring for young, demanding lives. This relentless battle against the elements, with so little at her disposal, made the simple act of keeping her children alive and healthy a daily feat of heroic endurance, demonstrating the profound and often invisible labor of motherhood in the 6th century. Number 3. Vulnerability to slavery and exploitation. Imagine waking each day with the chilling awareness that your child, your flesh and blood, could be taken from you, bought, sold, or seized, transformed from a beloved family member into someone else's property. For women in 590, this wasn't a distant nightmare, but a grim, ever-present reality. The vulnerability of children to slavery and various forms of exploitation was a pervasive threat, stemming from war, debt, poverty, and the very legal structures of the time. Protecting children from this fate required a constant, vigilant effort that often pushed mothers to the brink of desperation. The most dramatic and terrifying form of child abduction was during periods of warfare and raiding. In 590, Europe was a mosaic of emerging kingdoms and shifting borders. Frankish kings vied for power, Lombards asserted control in Italy, and various Germanic tribes continued to raid settled territories. When a village was attacked, whether by organized armies or opportunistic bandits, children were often considered valuable spoils of war. A mother, perhaps named Isolde, living in a small community in what is now modern-day France, might suddenly find her village engulfed in flames, the air filled with the shouts of attackers and the cries of the terrified. Her immediate instinct would be to gather her children, to hide them, to flee. But escaping with small, stumbling feet and the weight of an infant in her arms was incredibly difficult. In the chaos, children could be separated from their parents, rounded up and marched away, destined for a life of forced labor, perhaps even sold across vast distances, never to be seen again. Isolde would have been faced with an impossible choice: fight and risk immediate death, or try to hide, knowing that discovery could mean her children's enslavement. The psychological trauma of watching her children dragged away, or the lifelong guilt of escaping without them, knowing they were lost to the horrors of servitude, would be an unbearable burden. For those children who were taken, their new lives would be characterized by hard labor, meager food, and harsh treatment, stripped of their identity and family bonds. They might be forced to work in fields, as domestic servants, or even as gladiators or soldiers in some regions, their childhood stolen, their innocence shattered. Beyond the violence of war, poverty was a relentless driver of child exploitation. Famine, crop failure, or sudden economic hardship could plunge a family into unimaginable destitution. In such desperate circumstances, parents might be forced to make the agonizing decision to sell one or more of their children into servitude. This was not a choice made lightly, but one born of extreme duress, an attempt to save the rest of the family from starvation or to pay off insurmountable debts. A mother, her stomach aching with hunger, her children's ribs showing through their skin, might face the ultimate sacrifice, giving up one child so that the others might live. This was a form of voluntary slavery, where the sale was often for a limited term, perhaps until a debt was paid or a specific service rendered. However, the reality was often far harsher, with children losing touch with their families, their term of servitude often extended indefinitely by their new masters. Imagine a woman named Mariam, living in a Roman city, now slowly decaying, where opportunities were scarce. Her husband had succumbed to a fever, leaving her with 3 young mouths to feed and no means of support. She had tried selling her few possessions, begging in the marketplace, but it wasn't enough. One day, a local merchant, hearing of her plight, offered to take her eldest son, a boy of 10, as an apprentice, promised food, shelter, and training, but Mariam knew deep in her heart that this was little more than a thinly veiled form of servitude. Her son would be gone, bound to a master, subject to his will, and she would have no say in his daily life. The tears she shed as she watched him walk away were not just of sorrow, but of profound powerlessness. A mother forced by circumstance to break the very bond she longed to protect. Even without outright sale, children were often subjected to various forms of labor exploitation. From a very young age, children were expected to contribute to the household economy. Boys would assist in the fields, tend livestock, or learn a trade. Girls would help with domestic chores, childcare, and textile production. While much of this was a natural part of agrarian life, the line between contribution and exploitation could blur. Children might be expected to work long hours, perform tasks beyond their physical capabilities, or be denied adequate food and rest, impacting their growth and development. Mothers would struggle to balance the need for their children's labor with their desire to protect their bodies and spirits. The legal framework of the time offered little solace. While some Roman legal traditions had attempted to regulate slavery, the chaos of the post-Roman era often meant these laws were weakly enforced or ignored. In many emerging Germanic kingdoms, children born to enslaved parents were automatically considered slaves themselves, perpetuating a cycle of servitude across generations. A mother born into slavery had virtually no hope of securing freedom for her children. Their very birthright was their enslavement, a crushing reality that robbed them of any agency or future prospects beyond their master's will. Furthermore, children could be enslaved as punishment for a crime committed by their parents or as collateral for a loan. If a father defaulted on a debt, his children could be seized and sold to compensate the creditor. This meant that a mother, even if she herself was blameless, could see her children ripped from her arms due to her husband's misfortune or misjudgment. The sheer injustice of this system, where innocent children paid the price for adult actions, was another layer of terror for women who possessed little legal or financial power to intervene. Constant fear of slavery and exploitation shaped a mother's daily life. It dictated where she lived, how she raised her children, and the lengths she would go to protect them. She might teach them to hide at the first sign of trouble, to be silent, to appear insignificant. She might make desperate pleas to powerful figures, begging for mercy or protection. She might even resort to the ultimate heartbreaking act of sending her children away, entrusting them to relatives in distant villages or to monasteries, hoping they would be safer, even if it meant a painful separation. This profound vulnerability meant that a mother's love was not just a comforting presence, but a fierce, desperate, and often tragically insufficient shield against a world that saw children as commodities to be owned, traded, and exploited. Number 4. Limited medical knowledge and harsh birth conditions. Imagine giving birth in a world where the simplest infection could mean death, where superstition often outweighed genuine understanding of the human body, and where the most profound medical intervention was often little more than a prayer. For women in 590, the act of bringing a child into the world and then nurturing that fragile life was a terrifying gamble against astronomical odds, constantly shadowed by the profound limitations of medical knowledge and the sheer brutality of birthing conditions. Every labor was a dance with death for both mother and child, and every childhood illness was a potential tragedy waiting to unfold. Childbirth itself was an extraordinarily perilous event. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors in the modern sense, and certainly no sterile environments. Births almost always took place at home, often in cramped, unhygienic conditions, attended by a midwife or a female relative, whose knowledge was based on generations of passed-down traditions, some helpful, some utterly ineffective, and some actively harmful. A mother, perhaps, named Hilda, experiencing labor pains in her smoky, drafty dwelling, would be surrounded by her female kin. There would be no pain relief beyond herbal remedies, or perhaps a desperate plea to saints. The focus was on helping the child emerge, often through physical manipulation that could cause internal injuries to the mother, and without any understanding of hygiene. The greatest silent killer during childbirth was infection. Without knowledge of bacteria or sterilization, midwives and attending women would inadvertently transfer germs from their hands, from unclean instruments, or from contaminated water. Puerperal fever, a devastating infection of the reproductive organs after childbirth, was rampant and often fatal. For Hilda, the agony of labor would be compounded by the knowledge that her own life and the life of her newborn hung by a thread. If she survived the birth, she still faced the immediate threat of bleeding, tearing, and the dreaded postpartum infections that claimed countless lives. The very act of becoming a mother was fraught with mortal danger, and many women tragically succumbed, leaving behind their newborn infants, often with little chance of survival without their mother's milk and care. And even if both mother and child survived the initial trauma of birth, the infant mortality rate in 590 odd was staggeringly high. It's estimated that a significant percentage of children, perhaps as many as 1/3 or even half, did not live to see their first birthday. Many more would not reach adulthood. This was due to a confluence of factors, all rooted in the era's limited medical understanding. Breastfeeding, while vital for infant nutrition and immunity, was not always possible or sufficient, especially if the mother was malnourished or ill. Wet nurses were an option for the wealthy, but for most, the mother's milk was the sole source of sustenance, and if it failed, the child faced dire consequences. Diseases that today are easily preventable or treatable were lethal scourges. Childhood fevers, often a symptom of underlying infections, were terrifyingly common. A mother, witnessing her child's body burning up with fever, convulsing, or struggling to breathe, would be gripped by a profound sense of helplessness. Her medical interventions might include applying poultices of herbs, chanting prayers, or resorting to folk remedies like cold compresses or special amulets. While some herbs had mild medicinal properties, the vast majority of these practices were ineffective against serious bacterial or viral infections. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of viruses, no vaccinations. Gastrointestinal diseases, such as dysentery and cholera, were rampant due to unsanitary water sources and poor hygiene. Infants and young children with their weaker immune systems were particularly susceptible to severe dehydration caused by vomiting and diarrhea. A mother, perhaps named Theodora, living in a crowded, unsanitary city, would constantly worry about the water she fetched from the communal well or the food she prepared. Despite her best efforts at cleanliness, contaminated water or food could quickly lead to a fatal illness. Watching her child waste away, unable to hold down food or water, Theodora would be able to do little more than offer sips of weak herbal infusions and pray. The despair of seeing her child's strength drain away day by day, knowing she was powerless to stop it, was an unbearable burden. Respiratory infections, like pneumonia and bronchitis, were also major killers, exacerbated by the smoky indoor environments and damp, cold dwellings. A simple cough could quickly escalate into a life-threatening struggle for breath. Skin infections, often from minor cuts or scrapes, could turn septic due to the lack of antiseptic knowledge, leading to gangrene or widespread infection. Open wounds, common for children playing or working, were constant entry points for dangerous pathogens. The very concept of hygiene was rudimentary, while some Roman practices had included public baths. By 590, and many of these had fallen into disrepair or were no longer used. Personal cleanliness was often limited, and the understanding of how dirt and waste spread disease was non-existent. Vermin, such as fleas and lice, were common, vectors for diseases like typhus. A mother's endless battle against illness was a battle against an invisible enemy, one she could not comprehend or effectively combat. Beyond the physical ailments, there was a profound lack of knowledge about developmental issues or mental health. Children with disabilities, whether physical or cognitive, would have faced immense challenges in a world with no support systems. Their care would fall entirely on the family, primarily the mother, with no understanding of their specific needs. Such children were sometimes seen as burdens or even as signs of divine displeasure, adding another layer of social and emotional difficulty for the mother. The sheer frequency of child death meant that mothers lived in a constant state of anticipatory grief. They would likely have experienced the loss of siblings, friends, and their own children multiple times. This constant proximity to death shaped their emotional landscape, fostering a deep, protective love tinged with an almost inevitable sorrow. Every cry of a feverish child, every pale face would have sent a jolt of terror through a mother's heart, knowing how tenuous life was, how easily it could be extinguished by an ailment for which she had no cure, only a boundless love and an aching helplessness. This relentless reality of limited medical knowledge and harsh birthing conditions was arguably the most pervasive and heartbreaking challenge women faced in their desperate efforts to keep their children alive. Number 5. Scarcity of food and famine. Imagine a gnawing, constant emptiness in your stomach, a feeling that your body is slowly consuming itself. Now imagine that feeling not just for yourself, but magnified 1,000 times by the sight of your child's hollow cheeks, their ribs showing beneath thin skin, their cries of hunger echoing in your ears. For women in 590, the scarcity of food and the terrifying specter of famine were not abstract concepts, but a brutal recurring reality that forced agonizing choices and demanded extraordinary resilience. Every day was a relentless pursuit of sustenance, and every harvest a desperate gamble against the very real possibility of starvation. The agricultural practices of the 6th century were rudimentary by modern standards. Crop yields were low, dependent entirely on the winds of weather and the fertility of the soil, which was often depleted by continuous cultivation without proper fertilization. There was little understanding of crop rotation, pest control, or efficient irrigation. This meant that a single bad harvest could trigger widespread hunger, prolonged drought, excessive rains leading to flooding, or an unexpected pest infestation could wipe out a season's labor, leaving entire communities on the brink of starvation. Consider a woman named Clara, living in a small farming community in the Italian countryside. Her family's survival hinged entirely on their small plot of wheat and the few livestock they managed to keep. One year, the spring rains were insufficient, followed by a scorching summer. Clara watched, her heart sinking, as the wheat stalks withered and turned brown, barely producing any grain. The milk from their cow dwindled, and the chickens laid fewer eggs. As the meager stores from the previous year ran out, the chilling reality began to set in. There wasn't enough food. For a mother, this was the ultimate test. Her instinct was to protect her children, to feed them, even if it meant her own stomach growled in protest. Clara would meticulously divide what little food they had, always giving the largest portions to her children, knowing that their small developing bodies needed it most. She would deny herself, growing thinner and weaker, but her resolve to keep her children alive was unyielding. The hunger pangs would be constant, a dull ache that never truly subsided, but the sight of her children's declining health was far more agonizing. Malnutrition was a widespread issue even in good times. Children were often stunted, weak, and highly susceptible to disease because their bodies lacked the necessary nutrients to build strong immune systems. A minor infection that a well-fed child might fight off could be fatal for a child weakened by hunger. When the stored food ran out, mothers would turn to desperate measures. Foraging for wild edibles became essential. Clara would venture into the forests and fields, searching for roots, berries, wild greens, anything that could provide even a sliver of sustenance. This was a dangerous endeavor, exposing her to wild animals, poisonous plants, and potential encounters with bandits or rival groups. She would teach her children what was safe to eat, passing down generations of vital survival knowledge. But the constant worry of misidentification, of picking something toxic, was always present. Sometimes, the land simply offered nothing. During severe famine, people would eat bark, roots, insects, anything to quiet the insistent pangs of hunger. Livestock, usually cherished for their long-term value, would be slaughtered, their meat providing temporary relief but condemning the family to a future without milk, eggs, or draft power. Stories passed down through generations recounted the horrors of cannibalism during the worst famines, a dark testament to the unimaginable depths of desperation that widespread starvation could lead to. For a mother facing such a bleak prospect, the mental and emotional toll would be immense as she fought against the breakdown of her very humanity in the struggle to keep her children alive. The lack of effective food preservation techniques exacerbated the problem. Most food was consumed fresh or dried, salted, or smoked, but these methods were far from perfect and susceptible to spoilage, pests, and dampness. Large-scale storage facilities were rare, and transportation networks were primitive, meaning that even if one region had a surplus, it was difficult to transport food to an area suffering from scarcity. This isolation meant that communities often faced their hunger alone, unable to rely on outside aid. For women whose husbands or fathers were merchants, soldiers, or traveled for work, their absence during times of scarcity meant an even greater burden. The woman was left to manage the dwindling resources, make impossible choices, and keep her children from succumbing to hunger without the support of a male provider. The psychological impact of watching her children weaken, their energy draining away, their eyes growing dull, would be profound. There was the constant, horrifying question: which child would succumb first? The guilt, the sorrow, the sheer desperation of a mother who could not feed her own children would be an unspeakable torture. Famine also led to widespread displacement. As food ran out, families would often abandon their homes in search of sustenance elsewhere. This meant arduous journeys, often on foot, with children weakened by hunger and vulnerable to exposure, disease, and attack. A mother, perhaps, carrying an infant and pulling a toddler, would walk for days, her feet bleeding, her body aching, her mind consumed by the single thought: find food for her children. The journey itself often claimed lives, adding to the tragic toll of starvation. The constant threat of hunger shaped every aspect of a woman's life. In 590, it dictated her daily chores, her choices, and her deepest fears. It meant a life of relentless toil, always striving to produce, gather, or preserve enough to keep her family from the edge. For a mother, every meal provided was a small victory, every full belly a temporary reprieve, but the shadow of scarcity always loomed, a persistent, terrifying reminder of the fragility of life and the immense challenge of keeping her beloved children fed in a world of chronic scarcity. Number 6. Constant warfare and raids. Imagine the sudden, terrifying clang of an alarm bell or the distant, ominous sound of hoofbeats growing closer. For women in 590, and this was not a rare occurrence, but a stark reality of life in a fragmented, often violent world. Constant warfare, tribal skirmishes, and opportunistic raids were a relentless threat that could shatter lives in an instant, leaving behind death, destruction, and profound trauma. Protecting children from this chaotic violence was an immediate, visceral challenge that demanded quick thinking, immense courage, and often heart-breaking sacrifice. The late 6th century was a period of immense political instability across Europe. The old Roman Empire had dissolved, replaced by a patchwork of emerging kingdoms: the Franks, the Lombards, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, and others constantly vying for territory, resources, and dominance. Beyond these larger conflicts, there were localized feuds, banditry, and incursions by smaller, desperate groups. No settled area, whether a bustling town or a secluded village, was truly safe from the unpredictable eruption of violence. Consider a woman named Lena living with her 2 young children in a small, unwalled village near a contested borderland. One dawn, the air is suddenly rent by the shouts of men, the neighing of horses, and the terrifying crackle of fire. Raiders, perhaps a rival tribe, or even simply desperate men from a neighboring lord's territory, have descended upon their home. Lena's immediate instinct is to shield her children. There are no safe bunkers, no organized evacuation plans. Her only options are to hide, to flee, or to attempt to appease the attackers. Often a futile and dangerous choice. In the chaos of an attack, children were particularly vulnerable. They were too small to understand the danger, too slow to keep up with fleeing adults, and their cries could betray a hiding place. Lena might grab her infant, clutching him tightly, and pull her toddler by the hand, desperate to find a hidden corner in their small hut, or to slip out the back and disappear into the surrounding woods or fields. The sound of destruction, the breaking of pottery, the splintering of wood, the screams of neighbors would be etched into her memory, a terrifying soundtrack to her desperate attempt to save her family. If they managed to flee, the dangers did not end. Exposure to the elements was an immediate threat. Running through forests or across open plains, often with bare feet or inadequate clothing, could lead to injury, hypothermia, or heat stroke, especially for children already weakened by malnutrition or illness. Lena would have to carry her exhausted children or coax them forward with promises she might not be able to keep, all while remaining vigilant for more attackers or other dangers lurking in the wilderness. Finding food and water on the run was an almost impossible task, adding the specter of starvation to the immediate physical threats. Beyond the immediate danger of violence, the aftermath of a raid brought its own set of challenges. Homes were often burned, crops destroyed, and livestock stolen. If Lena returned to her village, she might find nothing but smoldering ruins. Their meager possessions, vital for survival, tools, stored food, spare clothing, would be gone. This meant immediate destitution and a desperate struggle to rebuild from scratch, often without resources or assistance. Children already traumatized by witnessing violence might be forced to live in makeshift shelters or open fields, exposed to the elements and prey to disease. The psychological scars of such an event could last a lifetime, manifesting in nightmares, fear, and a deep-seated distrust of strangers. A child who witnessed violence, the loss of family members, or the destruction of their home would carry that burden for years, affecting their development and sense of security. Displacement was a common outcome of constant warfare. Families would become refugees, wandering from place to place in search of safety, sustenance, and a new beginning. This migratory existence was incredibly hard on children, disrupting any sense of routine, education, or community. They would be exposed to new diseases in unfamiliar areas, face discrimination or hostility from wary locals, and constantly live with the uncertainty of where their next meal would come from, or where they would sleep that night. For a mother, guiding her children through this endless journey, providing a semblance of normalcy and hope amidst utter chaos, was a monumental task. She would be the constant source of comfort, protection, and resilience, even as her own spirit was battered by the hardships. Furthermore, children could be abducted during raids, not just for slavery, but sometimes as hostages or as a means of exacting ransom. A mother might receive a terrifying demand for payment, knowing that if she could not meet it, her child would be lost, potentially killed or sold into a life of servitude. The helplessness of being unable to muster the resources to save her own child would be an agonizing moral and emotional dilemma. The very real possibility of losing children to abduction meant mothers had to teach their children to hide, to be silent, to avoid strangers, skills that robbed them of the carefree innocence of childhood. Even if a family survived a raid physically intact, the ripple effects of constant warfare were pervasive. Men were often conscripted into armies, leaving women to manage the household and care for the children alone. The absence of a father meant a significant loss of labor, protection, and income, pushing families further into poverty and vulnerability. Constant threat of war also meant that agricultural work could be interrupted, trade routes disrupted, and resources diverted to military efforts, leading to widespread scarcity and famine compounding the existing challenges. For women in 590, the battlefield was not a distant concept, but could appear, without warning, on their very doorstep. Their lives were a ceaseless vigil, their actions driven by an innate primal urge to protect their children from the brutal realities of a world defined by conflict. Every shadow, every sound, every stranger on the horizon could signal impending danger, forcing them to live in a constant state of alert, their bodies and minds perpetually strained by the ever-present threat of violence. Their children, this unending cycle of fear, flight, and rebuilding forged women of incredible fortitude, but also left an indelible mark of trauma and loss on their lives. Number 7. Widespread disease and high infant mortality. Imagine a silent, invisible enemy that lurked in every shadow, hitched a ride on every breath, and struck down the strongest and the weakest with terrifying impartiality. For women in 590, this enemy was widespread disease, a constant, pervasive threat that made the very act of childhood a lottery. With rudimentary medical understanding, non-existent sanitation, and the lingering shadow of past plagues, mothers faced the agonizing reality that their children, despite their boundless love and tireless care, could be snatched away by sickness at any moment. The sheer scale of infant and child mortality was the most heartbreaking and relentless challenge of their lives. The 6th century was still reeling from the devastating impact of the plague of Justinian, which had first swept across the Byzantine Empire and beyond in the mid-500s. While the initial massive waves had passed by 590, the plague had recurred in localized outbreaks for decades, transforming the social and demographic landscape. Even if the immediate threat of plague wasn't looming over every village, countless other endemic diseases flourished silently, claiming lives. These included smallpox, measles, dysentery, typhus, influenza, and a myriad of bacterial infections. Consider a mother named Ayala living in a small Germanic settlement, perhaps near a marshy area. She would have already mourned siblings, friends, and likely several of her own children who had succumbed to various illnesses. For Ayala, a child's fever was not a minor inconvenience, but a terrifying harbinger of potential doom. When her youngest, a toddler named Finn, developed a cough that quickly turned into a struggle for breath, Ayala would be consumed by a frantic sense of helplessness. She would try the remedies passed down through generations, Herbal poultices made from leaves and roots steaming Finn over bowls of hot water infused with fragrant plants, wrapping him tightly in wool to sweat out the fever. But there was no real cure for pneumonia, no understanding of how bacteria attacked the lungs, no antibiotics to stem the tide of infection. The lack of sanitation was a major contributing factor to the rampant spread of disease. Waste disposal was primitive or non-existent. Human and animal waste often accumulated in or near living areas, contaminating water sources and attracting disease-carrying vermin like rats and flies. Communal wells, streams, and rivers from which people drew their drinking water were often polluted. A mother might unknowingly be bringing home the very pathogens that would sicken her children. Children, playing in dirt and mud, often with open sores or cuts, were particularly susceptible to infection from contaminated soil and water. Diarrheal diseases caused by waterborne pathogens were a leading cause of death in infants and young children, who rapidly succumbed to dehydration. Ayala would have no knowledge of boiling water or the importance of hand washing. She would just see her child growing weaker, their body wasting away, unable to hold down any food or drink, and would be utterly powerless to stop the devastating progression of the illness. Furthermore, nutrition was often poor, even when food was available. Diets lacked variety and essential vitamins, leaving children with weakened immune systems unable to fight off infections. Anemia, rickets, and other nutritional deficiencies were common, making children more vulnerable to every pathogen they encountered. A mother, doing her best to provide what little food she had, often did not understand the vital link between diet and health. She would focus on simply filling their bellies, unaware that her children's bodies were not getting the building blocks they needed to defend themselves against the constant onslaught of invisible enemies. Close living quarters, particularly in crowded villages or urban areas, facilitated the rapid spread of airborne diseases like measles and smallpox. Once an illness entered a household, it often swept through every member. But children, with their immature immune systems, were often the first and most severely affected. Ayala would watch as one child succumbed, then another, feeling a profound sense of despair as she moved from one sickbed to the next, nursing, comforting, and preparing for the inevitable. The concept of quarantine was not widely practiced or understood, so the sick were rarely isolated, ensuring continuous transmission. The sheer frequency of child death meant that mothers lived in a state of constant, pervasive grief. They would have witnessed countless children perish, their own, their siblings, their neighbors. The average life expectancy was very low, and it was considered a blessing if even half of one's children survived to adulthood. This meant that a mother's heart was often a landscape of buried hopes and past sorrows. Every smile from a healthy child was cherished, but it was also a bittersweet reminder of the fragility of life and the terrifying knowledge that any day could be the last. The emotional toll of this repeated loss, the constant fear of the next sickness, was immense. Mothers learned to temper their hopes, to grieve profoundly, but also to move forward, driven by the need to protect the children who remained. Beyond the major diseases, everyday hazards also posed a significant risk. Poor hygiene meant minor injuries could easily become infected, leading to sepsis or even death. Open wounds, common among children playing or working, were constant entry points for bacteria. The absence of effective wound care, beyond perhaps applying a poultice or a prayer, meant that simple cuts or scrapes could quickly turn fatal. Even childbirth itself was a major source of infection for both mother and infant, as discussed earlier. Puerperal fever in the mother, and infections like tetanus in the newborn from an unclean umbilical cord cut were rampant. The lack of understanding about contagion, the true causes of disease, and effective treatments left mothers feeling profoundly helpless. They could perform acts of immense care and comfort, but they lacked the knowledge to truly fight the invisible killers. This profound helplessness, coupled with the heartbreaking reality of constant loss, made widespread disease and high infant mortality the most formidable and sorrowful challenge women faced in their desperate and courageous attempts to protect their children in the fragile world of 590.